So for those of you who are joining this morning, not having had the blessing of being here the last few weeks, let me orient you. And for those of you who have been here, it's probably worth orienting as well, because 2 weeks ago, we were finishing up the book of James. Last week, we did 2 John, the short letter of John's second epistle. And this morning, we're looking at 3 John. And to place all of this in context, I thought maybe we'd start with a 2-minute clip from the Bible Project and give Tim Mackey a shot at sort of framing these epistles for us.
The letters of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. 1st John is actually anonymous, but 2nd and 3rd John are written by someone who's called the Elder. Now, the language and style of all 3 of these works are identical to each other and to John's Gospel. And so most people think that all of them come from the disciple that Jesus loved. Now, that could be John, the son of Zebedee, one of the 12 apostles, or it could be another John among Jesus' earliest disciples, known as John the Elder. Whichever John it was, he's now in his old age, and he's overseeing a network of house church communities that are likely around the city of ancient Ephesus. Now, from clues within the gospel and from these letters, it seems that these communities were made up mostly of Jewish followers of Jesus, and that they had recently gone through a crisis that motivated John to write these letters. He mentions that a group of people have broken off from these churches. These people no longer acknowledge Jesus as Israel's Messiah or as the Son of God. And they're stirring up hostility among those who stayed faithful to the churches. In fact, 2nd and 3rd John clearly address this conflict. 2nd John is a warning to a specific house church. There are people who deny Jesus. John calls them deceivers. And they're probably going to come looking for validation or support, and this church community is not to offer any. 3rd John is actually written to a member of one of these house churches, a man named Gaius. And the elder asks him to welcome legitimate missionaries who are going to arrive soon. He has to tell him to do this because the leader of that church community, Diotrephes, is acting like a jerk, and he's rejecting anybody associated with John the Elder. And so these letters give us a window into the tension and conflict that John faced in these churches. And 1st John was written as a response to all of this, as a form of damage control. The elder assures those who still believe in the Messiah, Jesus, that God is with them as they adhere to the truth. And all of this helps.
And we'll leave it right there because the rest of the video goes on and unpacks in some detail 1 John, but that's not our text. We think we covered 1 John a year ago, year and a half ago, somewhere back the line. If some of you have memories of studying 1 John, take a blessing on your head. But our task today is to look at these last 2 just little short letters from whoever it was that wrote them. And if you followed Mackey, you realize there's a certain amount of guessing that goes on here. Probably written by this person named John, but maybe by another person named John. And the first letter is anonymous, but scholars have concluded that it's a single voice, and traditionally it's John, the beloved disciple. So last week, Jeff led us through some reflections on 2 John, and Jeff explained the importance of, as he put it, looking back to Jesus rather than looking forward and sort of trying to be innovative and do new stuff. We need to anchor the life of the church and our beliefs in Jesus. So we look back. We look back to the Jesus who came in the flesh. And in 2 John, as Jeff noted a week ago, hospitality, though it's important, does not extend to people who are denying that Jesus came in the flesh, who are denying the core pieces of the gospel. In the 2nd epistle of John, he says, don't let those people in. Like, don't even let them in the house. Now in 3 John, we're changing moods. And for those of you who were here last week, you'll remember Jeff's cool little graphic with 2 Johns slamming the door and then 3 Johns opening the door. So we're now at the graphic of the 3 Johns opening the door, if that's helpful in any way to any of you. In what ways are people tempted to stray from the truth? Jeff asked a week ago. What safeguards can we put in place as a church to kind of keep out false teaching, to keep out the people who are not looking back to Jesus, but are looking forward and wanting to sort of innovate and change and lay aside the orthodox gospel of Jesus Christ? What are those guardrails? What are those safeguards that can help us stay in place? And how do we know if we're being a little too open or a little too welcoming to people who are looking forward rather than looking back? So that was last week. Today we move on to the letter, which has been summarized like this. 3 John is a letter to an individual, the beloved Gaius, encouraging him to show hospitality to faithful teachers who represent the apostolic message and warning him about a disruptive local leader, I think Mackie says his name in church, is that his line? Who rejects apostolic authority and refuses to welcome the brethren. There's 3 people that are named in 3 John. Gaius, to whom the letter is addressed, seems to be the person who exemplifies genuine fellowship, and he, Gaius, welcomes and supports traveling missionaries who John describes as those who went out for the sake of the name. He also mentions Diotrephes, who exemplifies the opposite. Diotrephes is rejecting John's authority, rejecting apostolic authority. He's refusing hospitality to what seems to be these traveling missionaries who are making their rounds, helping to build the kingdom. And Diotrephes won't even let them in. Not only that, but he's expelling people who don't agree with him about how to relate to them. And then he mentions Demetrius right toward the end. John commends him. Demetrius probably is the bearer of this letter, although the epistle doesn't say that, as an example of integrity to be received. So I'd like to read this short letter. It's just 15 verses. And it reads like this in the NIV. The elder, to my dear friend Gaius, whom I love in the truth. Dear friend, I pray that you may enjoy good health and that all may go well with you, even as your soul is getting along well. It gave me great joy when some believers came and testified about your faithfulness to the truth, telling how you continue to walk in it. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth. Dear friend, you are faithful in what you're doing for the brothers and sisters, even though they are strangers to you. They've told the church about your love. Please send them on their way in a manner that honors God. It was for the sake of the name that they went out, receiving no help from the pagans. We ought therefore to show hospitality to such people so that we may work together for the truth. It seems to be describing these traveling teachers, itinerant missionaries who've shown up in this house church, and Gaius has welcomed them. I wrote to the church that Diotrephes, who loves to be first, will not welcome us. So when I come, I'll call attention to what he's doing, spreading malicious nonsense about us. Not satisfied with that, he even refuses to welcome other believers, and he stops those who wants to do so and puts them out of the church. Dear friend, do not imitate what is evil, but what is good. Anyone who does what is good is from God. Anyone who does what is evil is not seen God. Demetrius is well spoken of by everyone. And where did Demetrius come from? We have no introduction to him here, but presumably, likely, he's the person carrying the letter. When he gets there, John is giving a recommendation to the bearer of the letter. Demetrius is well spoken of by everyone, and even by the truth itself. And we also speak well of him, and you know that our testimony is true. I have much to write you, but I do not want to do so with pen and ink. I hope to see you soon. We will talk face to face. Peace to you. The friends here send their greetings. Greet the friends there by name. It's interesting that he ends this letter the same way he ends the second letter, namely, I have a whole lot more I want to say, but I would just prefer not to write it. We're going to talk about it when I come. Did he come and talk about it in between 2 John and 3 John? Did he ever come and talk about it? We don't know. We're kind of on guessing territory there, as we are with a lot of other details related to these two epistles. What I want us to reflect on for the moments we have together this morning, and by the way, just for those of you who are visiting or who are new, we often at the end of a teaching time sort of break up into little groups to talk about a set of questions. We're going to try to have just a few minutes to do that at the end. So what's in focus here, among other things that we might point to, like how do you show hospitality to traveling missionaries? I wasn't sure that was a particularly sort of cutting edge issue for us. We can talk about that some other time if it's helpful, but we're not going to talk so much about that today. What's in focus, I think, here that's of interest to us is this question of authority. Even in these opening years of the Christian church, questions of authority appear to be alive and well. I'm fascinated by John, apostolic era John, whichever John he was. He's pushing up against this guy who's apparently a local house church pastor, leader, and Diotrephes is sort of holding John at arm's length. He doesn't acknowledge his authority. So this starts this question of, like, who's in charge around here? And who gets to decide what gets taught and what doesn't get taught, and who gets welcomed as genuine teachers and who gets shut out as false teachers? Who decides that? Diotrephes apparently is a recognized church leader. He's talked about that way. I've written something to the church, but Diotrephes, who likes to put himself first, does not acknowledge our authority. If I come, I'll bring up what he's doing, talking wicked nonsense about us, as the ESV puts it. So Diotrephes is using his authority to decide which teachers to welcome and which ones not. And John is saying, we should be welcoming these guys. Diotrephes says, no, we don't want to hear from them. And so you have this sort of butting heads between John and Diotrephes. Did they ever meet in person? Did John ever put him in his place? I don't think we know. Diotrephes even kicks out of the church members who disagree with his decisions about what is acceptable teaching and who are acceptable teachers and who aren't. That's pretty dramatic. It's not just that he's using his influence to keep people out that John says you should be welcoming. He's kicking out of the church people that disagree with his decisions about that. John, in writing this, appears to be pretty confident in his own authority as an apostle. He says, this is Diotrephes, who likes to put himself first. He does not acknowledge our authority. John seems confident that he's on solid ground in making the calls about who should be welcomed, who should be listened to, who should have the door slammed in their face. Diotrephes seems to think he knows this too, but John's claiming maybe a different kind of authority, maybe what we call apostolic authority. So there's a lot, we could make a very long list, of course, about the things we don't know about Diotrephes, since it's almost everything we could put on a theoretical list, but I'm just going to list a few things of interest. We don't know where this church was. Tim Mackey says probably around Ephesus, but I don't think we know that, and so therefore we don't know where Diotrephes was. We don't know exactly what his beliefs were. Was he actually unorthodox? Was he one of the people denying that Jesus came in the flesh? John doesn't say that. What John says is that he's spreading rumors about us and he's not welcoming these teachers. But what were his actual beliefs? I don't think we know. And we don't know what letter of John's Diotrephes ignored. John says, I've written something to the church that Diotrephes, who calls himself first, does not acknowledge our authority. So what was in that letter? Was that 2 John? Not necessarily. Maybe. He just says, I wrote something to the church and Diotrephes didn't accept it, didn't recognize it. So we don't actually know for sure what was in that letter. And we don't actually know what became of Diotrephes and his church. Like Diotrephes just sort of live out a happy life as pastor in his house church and sort of formed his own little denomination and then retired and was honored as a church leader at the end? Or did John show up and kick him out of the church? We don't know. We don't know anything about him except this just little sketch that we have in 3 John. So what we do know, we're on more solid footing here. What we do know is that across the history of the church, ever since the first century, Diotrephes has become a kind of whipping boy for whatever the worry was in that particular era about church authority. So, for example, for the early church fathers, Diotrephes represents a sort of prideful rebellion. And we can trace that if we had time. We could trace it through Clement and through Tertullian, and beginning in the 2nd century, people are writing about Diotrephes and what he symbolizes as like a rebellious church leader. By the time you get to the Middle Ages, Diotrephes also gets quite a lot of attention. But in the Middle Ages, it's from Roman Catholic theologians who see him as one of the first people to challenge apostolic succession. Because apostolic succession as a doctrine, how do you know what true doctrine is? If you can trace your authority back through the line of the bishops of Rome, back to originally Peter and Paul, and then eventually Peter. So Diotrephes, he was a popular guy among medieval theologians who were defending apostolic succession. He said, this is how we know that our Pope has the authority of God behind him, because we can trace it. Well, for the Reformers, they weren't so big on apostolic succession. So they weren't claiming that they could trace their authority back through the popes. For the Reformers, Diotrephes is just a symbol of corrupt domination. Somebody that's like throwing his weight around in a way that he shouldn't do. For modern scholars, Diotrephes provides a snapshot into the very early evolution of institutional church authority. We're just starting to see the time when there's disagreement about who gets to make the call, and John is saying, I get to make the call because I'm an apostle, and Diotrephes is saying, no, you don't. And so it's just, this is an interesting window into the time when the church, the very early church, is trying to figure out church authority. Do any of them know anything about Diotrephes? No, actually, they don't know anything more about him than we do, which is next to nothing. It's only what John tells us in these couple of verses. So some questions for us to consider in our context. John said that Diotrephes, quote, does not acknowledge our authority. Well, it turns out that we, along with the rest of the Protestant tradition, have long ago abandoned the Roman Catholic insistence on apostolic succession. That's not how we tell what is acceptable teaching. That's not how we tell who we slam the door on, 2 John, who we open the door to, 3 John. The medieval Catholics knew. They always knew. Just ask the church. The church will tell you who has right teaching and who doesn't. Protestants said, we don't need the Pope to tell us what correct teaching is and what incorrect teaching is. What replaces it for us Protestants? It was Martin Luther who famously declared, and we celebrated Reformation Sunday, what, a week ago or just a few days ago, Reformation Day, I guess it was. It was Luther who famously said, unless I'm convinced from Scripture that what I've written is wrong, I won't recant. The Catholic Church said, Luther, you're wrong. And Luther said, no, I'm not. And unless I am convinced from Scripture that what I've written is wrong, I can change my mind. Because I need to be convinced. And it's that emphasis on unless I am convinced that in a sense has been a challenge for us as the Protestant wing of the church ever since. How does church authority work in our context? We all agree that Scripture is the final authority. All Protestants agree with that. But Scripture is interpreted by whom? With John and Diotrephes, it was John saying, I'm the apostle, and when I show up, I'm going to put him in his place. And hopefully he did, because we don't know. But we don't do that. We don't have anybody to do that. We've inherited Luther's formula that says, well, frankly, buddy, unless I'm convinced that you're right and I'm wrong, then I'm not changing my mind. Because it's just me and the Bible. So how have Protestants settled this question historically? Protestants have, in fact, settled this question by forming new groups around shared interpretations of Scripture and Christian living. That's the way we establish sources of authority. We just find a group of people that says, we all agree about this, and so now, and we're a church now. Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary's Center for Global Christianity estimates that there are roughly 47,300 Christian denominations globally, but this includes non-Protestant groups. So if you cut out the non-Protestant groups, it's probably more like 45,000. So this is exaggerated. So there's about 45,000 Protestant denominations who, like Luther, have said, we have the Bible, thank you. We can read it, thank you. And you're wrong, we're wrong. So here at OCC, we have settled this question. We settled this question in a sense procedurally by placing ourselves under the theological umbrella of the Rosedale network of churches. We don't, in fact, start with every question that comes up. As a congregation, we've said, we don't have a pope. We all agree that the Bible's the authority, and we also agree that we're not going to renegotiate every question that every person has about the Bible. We have a starting place as a kind of baseline for saying, well, here's what we agree to agree about. What is that? It's the theological statements of the Rosedale network of churches. Not necessarily because we think the Rosedale network statements are right and every other statement in the world is wrong. No, in fact, there's enormous overlap. But custom, tradition, in a sense, you have to figure out, like, what's the place of authority. And so for OCC, we've said, well, for our purposes, procedurally, we're part of the red zone network of churches. Does that settle all the questions that everybody has? Nope. But it does mean that we agree to agree about this in this way. And it's a kind of working, not hypothesis, it's a working agreement for how our church works. And there's, arguably maybe 45,000 other variations of that within the 45,000 denominations. So what I want you to do for the next 5-ish minutes, because we're already at that other time, I want you to reflect on how you've experienced church authority and what questions this book of 3 John and John, Gaius, Demetrius, and especially Diotrephes. What questions does that raise for you, and how do those questions interface with your own journey with the church? I think we have a workable arrangement at OCC. If you're at some other church in Columbus, unless it's Catholic, there's alternate arrangements. They say, well, we start here and we agree to kind of start here or here or here or here. And as I said, there's enormous overlap between those theological statements and sort of foundations. Is that good? Does that work out okay for you? Are you happy with the way church authority is played out in your life? Are you happy with the amount of freedom you have to say, well, unless I then? Is it okay to say, we agree, we defer, we submit, whatever the word? Take 5 minutes.